Ladies and gentlemen, MythVision podcast. Today, we're bringing the thunder and the lightning. That's right. We don't need Zeus. We don't need Jupiter. We're going to explain some cool stuff to you today. And I have Dr. John Wathey again joining me today. How are you?
I'm very good and delighted to be with you again.
I really appreciate you and your approach. I love the methodology that you're using. You're taking such mundane, obvious, simple things, using those systems to explain the world we live in, to understand why we yearn and long for affection and love. It's built into us not only genetically as a survival mechanism that, we're born with. We're even born with sensory perception and things like this, but it goes even further than that. That deep, innate, conscious feeling that we get, that we wonder, what is that? Explaining that through natural processes. And I don't think it stills the thunder. To me, it's not like it tells you the magic trick, therefore there's nothing in awe of it. It's even deeper. The appreciation for the loved ones that are around us rather than imaginary figures.
Yeah.
I think we can deepen our relationships to humans around us, taking the approach that you're describing in your methodology. So that's my introduction, but tell everybody who may not know who you are, what your expertise is, with your background, as we always do in the introduction, and then what you're presenting today.
Okay, sure. My background is as a scientist. I got a degree in biology from Caltech and a PhD in neurosciences from UC San Diego. And I studied in a lab where the specialty of the professor was what's called neuroethology. And that's a subdiscipline where the idea, the strategy for understanding the brain is to find some animal that has a highly specialized behavior that's been well studied, well understood. So you can go look into the brain of that animal and ask the question, how does this circuit solve this problem that we completely understand? So you simplified the question a little bit by doing that. So that's the neuroethology approach, and that has been the lens through which I have tried to understand human religiousness, because we are animals too, and we are born with certain predispositions and predilections, and we're a highly social species. We're also born helpless, utterly dependent on our parents, and especially in the first few days on our mothers. So those are the kinds of things that shaped my view of what religion is and where it comes from.
And it's a beautiful picture that you draw based on this. And we'll get into that. I imagine if you don't cover that in your lecture here, I want to get into people and their yearning for God and how this is a natural thing that people do this. So I've heard some atheists try to say, no, nobody is, you got to be indoctrinated to do this. And while I agree that in order to be indoctrinated to Adidas or Nike or whatever the brand is, the hardware and the software that is there, it's already there. It's something that is natural. And of course, we'll get to that. I know you have a presentation for us today, but before we do, I just got to give you a short plug here. Go to his website. It is in the description. You can find out more about Dr. Wathey. And of course, he goes by Jack or John. Either way, he isn't offended. I've heard him called both. And I'm just going to go with what your Amazon says. So it's John C Wathey. That way nobody gets confused. He has a couple books, The Phantom God. Make sure you go and get you a copy. What Neuroscience Reveals About the Compulsion to Believe. And then The Illusion of God's Presence, The Biological Origins of Spiritual Longing. I won't comment on this because his presentation, I'm sure, covers some of this, and I don't want to steal any of his lightning and thunder, especially since he's taking it away from Zeus and Jupiter. So I got to let him have the power here. But get the books, especially if you want to understand taking a naturalistic approach, explaining these things. And it's really quite wonderful the way he does. Also, join the Patreon, early content. I've got videos coming out. I've got more coming up. In fact, here's a teaser to all you lucky elitists in the crowds. I'm calling you elitist right now. I don't know why. I feel like you're something above. You're in your ivory tower here at MythVision. But you can ask questions. I'm having Dennis R. McDonald come to do Greek mimesis stuff. And I'm going to post a post on the Patreon saying, hey, look, If you have a question for Dr. McDonald, send it in. I'll record it in 4K, just like I did with Richard Carrier. And I plan on doing also for Kip Davis. So he's coming at the end of January. Join, help support us. And why not get a video that is going to last? I mean, history's being made, and you're on the video, your questions being asked of the academic on the video, 4K, high quality. What better way to put you on a pedestal, right, for helping support us? So check it out. Even if you're not here live, join. I will be having that post on the Patreon, and I look forward to that. Dr. Wathey, do you want to go ahead and start the presentation?
I will just say before we crank up the first slide that for those who saw my first two presentations on your podcast, this will be a little different. So I want to prepare you for that. The others were kind of intense and in-depth scientific presentations. This is a more personal thing. It's a bit shorter, but you'll catch on soon enough.
Well, yeah, and I hope that people who don't share your worldview, and Iris, like John, I'm with you. Sorry, I'm calling you by your first name. I feel comfortable doing so. You've told me, I think, to do that in the past, but I'm so used to saying doctor.
Yes, please.
I don't care to make everyone think like me. I at least want people to understand and at least be respectful of why I draw those conclusions. I'm not here to make everyone an atheist, but I'm also not here to just encourage fundamentalism to proceed. So I am here to get people to use their thinking skills, and I am trying to get people to reject the fundamentalist mentality that comes behind presuppositionalism within harmful cults, things like that. I do want to help people. So we understand where you're coming from. Try to understand where John's coming from today. And thank you, Yes, It's Me, for becoming a YouTube member. You have now truly achieved salvation. How does it feel? I know it feels good. So, John, you want me to go ahead and pop this thing on?
Yeah, let's go to the first slide here.
Okay.
Okay. I have to bring up my PowerPoint screen over here. Okay. Apollo was once a god. This is the two-part story of my journey into and out of religion, set against the backdrop of the golden age of space exploration. Part 1, Coming of Age in the Space Age. In the spring of 2005, it became obvious that my frail elderly parents could no longer live independently in their home. My father was hospitalized and near death, struggling with a weak heart and complications from surgery after a fall that broke his hip. My mother moved into assisted living, while I spent the most strenuous weeks of my life cleaning out the family home, getting it ready for sale. The biggest chore was the attic, cramped, unbearably hot, dusty, and choked with boxes from decades of accumulation that some might call hoarding. There were, however, a few sentimental treasures amid the cardboard strata, like the July 1960 issue of National Geographic. Seeing it for the first time in decades brought a flood of memories. This was one of my favorite things in early childhood. The dramatic illustration on the cover captured my 6-year-old imagination, as did the other photos in the article. I doubt I could have gleaned much from the text as a first grader, but Dad explained the pictures for me. I have no memory of Sputnik from 1957, but I vividly remember 2 TV shows about space from that same time, probably because they were reinforced by subsequent reruns. These were Walt Disney's Man and the Moon in 1955 and Mars and Beyond in 1957. After fanciful animated introductions, both shows depicted Wernher von Braun's vision of how humans would travel to the moon and Mars. So Disney and von Braun triggered my obsession with spaceflight, but my father sustained it. He was equally fascinated. I remember seeing on his nightstand a paperback book with the simple title, Satellite. I never found that in the attic, but its intriguing cover is as deeply burned into my memory as the red-hot Mercury capsule on the National Geographic. A few years ago, I tracked down Satellite in the public library and read it, just to learn what visions of spaceflight my dad had been pondering way back then. It was written before Sputnik, and it was mostly about the role of satellites in the upcoming International Geophysical Year. I was impressed by how technically substantive it was, yet stunned and amused to read a speculative passage near the end that seemed to imbue the flying saucer craze with scientific credibility. A year after that memorable National Geographic issue, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. 6 weeks after that, President Kennedy challenged the nation to land a man on the moon. From that time on, space exploration was real. What a time to be alive. By age 10, I had a 4-inch reflecting telescope, and Dad and I would brave cold, clear winter nights to marvel at Jupiter's moons, Saturn's ring, and the mountains and craters of the moon. Meanwhile, projects Mercury and Gemini put Americans into space, and like many other kids at that time, I imagined that I was just about the right age to become an astronaut when NASA began recruiting for missions to Mars. In addition to cold, clear nights, Dad and I shared Sunday mornings. He was Presbyterian and my mom Catholic, and the Catholic Church only sanctioned mixed marriages if the couple agreed to raise all children as Catholics. My parents bent this rule by agreeing to raise their firstborn son as a Presbyterian, so that Dad need not go to church alone. And I turned out to be that son. My Christian indoctrination began right about the same time as Sputnik. I didn't fully appreciate it then, but these two forces, religious dogma and scientific discovery, were already fomenting conflict in my young brain. To my father, science and religion were perfectly compatible and complementary, but the sermons to which he brought me said otherwise. I first noticed this with one preacher in particular. I remember only 2 of his pronouncements on science, though there were surely many more. One was the specious claim that because science cannot explain the flight of a bee, God must exist. The other was not a creationist argument, but more along the lines of the mythical Tower of Babel. The preacher was railing against one of NASA's unmanned Ranger spacecraft, which was hurtling out of control toward the moon as he spoke. He mentioned the great cost of the program and decried the profligate waste, but his implied message was that God did not want uppity scientists invading his heavenly realm. I can't remember which Ranger failed that day. All of the first 6 failed, but I vividly remember Ranger 7. The Ranger program was the work of the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech. Its formal goal was to get high-resolution images of potential Apollo landing sites, images that would reveal hazards large enough to destroy a lunar lander, yet small enough to evade detection by Earth-based telescopes. There were also broader and more important goals. Learn how to navigate a spacecraft to the moon by doing it. Learn how to miniaturize the electronics. And above all, learn how to make robotic spacecraft that could explore the rest of the solar system at a tiny fraction of the cost of manned missions. For Ranger, the mission plan was simple and suicidal. Return video images of the moon while following a collision course. Beginning in August of 1961, the first 2.5 years of the program yielded nothing but failure, embarrassment, and criticism. The vindication came on July 31st, 1964, when Ranger 7 worked flawlessly. I remember watching the successive still images on TV, which came down every 5 seconds, much more slowly than the video you're seeing here. But even at that slow rate, you could get the impression of approach, acceleration, and impending doom for poor Ranger 7, especially when the end was near. This image shows the 13-meter impact crater left by Ranger 7, as seen from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2010. For me, however, Ranger 7 made another kind of impact. It was a beautiful demonstration of how science works. Trial and error, ruthless honesty, rejection of bad ideas, refinement of models, and successive approximation as the only meaningful path to truth. And although I would need a few more years to make the mental connection, Ranger had proved the preacher wrong. No omnipotent God was thwarting our attempts to probe his heavenly realm. We could go there, and the successes kept coming. A year later, a spacecraft arrived from the basic Ranger design called Mariner 4, returned stunningly detailed images of Mars from about 12,000 kilometers above the Martian surface. Meanwhile, Ranger's successor at the Moon, the soft landing robotic Surveyor, made footprints in the lunar dust 3 years before Neil Armstrong made his. It was mathematics, physics, and chemistry that got us to the Moon, not religion. It was not revelation, but open eyes, imagination, experimentation, meticulous reasoning, willingness to admit error, hard work, and persistence that advanced human knowledge and understanding. I sometimes regret that I never witnessed the launch of a Saturn V in person, but I did get to visit Launch Complex 39 in its glory days. In May of 1967, my thoughtful parents bought me a ticket to join a student tour of the Kennedy Space Center. The highlight was the gargantuan vehicle assembly building where the Saturn V was built. My little Instamatic camera could not capture it, not even in these 2 frames. Even now, I can't find words that adequately convey the immensity of this structure, the largest building in the world by volume at the time. I had witnessed the energy and optimism of that time and place. It epitomized a nation that confidently rode converging waves of post-war prosperity and Cold War competition to the moon. By the time I was cleaning out my parents' attic, those waves had long since dissipated, but a robust program of robotic space exploration had continued, and Dad had followed it in the pages of National Geographic. He would survive his hip replacement surgery, and he would live another 3 years, though the ordeal left him mentally diminished. For me, the most striking evidence of this came in January of 2006 as we watched the launch of New Horizons to Pluto on TV. I explained the details of the planned mission, much as he had long ago explained the fascinating images in National Geographic. I told him how special and exciting this was, the first good look at the most distant and mysterious planet in the solar system. I said, now you must live another 9 years just to see those pictures of Pluto. But in striking contrast to his former self, he was utterly uninterested and dismissive. 9 years later, I reveled in the stunning images of Pluto from New Horizons, wistfully thinking how much Dad, in his prime, would have loved this. Part 2. Why this atheist loves the Christmas Eve message from Apollo 8. I begin with a quote from author Salman Rushdie, who for a mere 4 months ago was brutally stabbed and nearly killed by a religious fanatic. We know of many religions which have ceased to be active, like extinct volcanoes. The Greek myths of today were originally the Greek religion and had temples and priests and inquisitions, no doubt. The world is full of dead religions. And to my mind, what happens when people stop believing in them literally is that you can then believe in them in a more beautiful way, a story. Many of the ancient traditions suggest that there is a moment when human beings outgrow the gods. I see that as being related in a human life to the process of growing up. When you're young, even when you're an adolescent, you need parents. But there's a point at which you move from that to being able to make your own life decisions. I see that religious experience as being part of the childhood and adolescence of the human race. And when we grow up, hopefully, we grow out of it. In part one, I recounted the joys of growing up during the golden age of human spaceflight. That age and my childhood ended with Apollo. For most of us who remember that time, Apollo 8 left two indelible memories. One was Bill Anders' iconic image of Earthrise from lunar orbit. The other was the reading to the people of the Earth on Christmas Eve of verses 1 through 10 of the first chapter of Genesis. Both still evoke goosebumps and tears when I see them in documentary films. But how could an atheist love the reading of Genesis in this context? NASA is a government agency, and the astronauts were government employees on the job, representing America, if not all of humanity. Wasn't this a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? A lawsuit was filed at the time to make that point, and many atheists still feel that way about it. They argue that the text was sacred to one tradition, and reading it in that moment of global fascination spoiled what should have been a unifying celebration of human achievement. Well, I understand their feelings, but I think they can't see the forest for the trees. Consider these recent thoughts from astronaut Bill Anders on the Christmas Eve message. The creation myth or the creation story is pretty fundamental. I can't speak for the other guys, but to me it was not a religious thing, so much as a kind of hard hit to the psychological solar plexus that would mark to humankind the gravity of man's first departure from his home planet. Anders went on to say that spaceflight had convinced him that our Earth was neither the center of the universe nor the focus of divine attention. Evidently, he also appreciated that most of us are so immersed in the routine of daily life that we seldom, if ever, contemplate the deep mysteries of human existence. What are we? What is this strange universe in which we find ourselves? Where did it come from? How can we comprehend it? Reading the myth of creation while showing our tiny planet in the vastness of space is one way to jar the sleepwalkers of Earth into awareness. But is there another way, one that would have had the same effect, but without the religious reference? Yes, of course. In 1931, David Lasser, a visionary rocket enthusiast and author, offered this alternative in the voice of a fictional astronaut viewing the whole Earth against the blackness of space for the first time. We are silent before this spectacle. We are suspended motionless in an eternity of space and time. The silence of the dark spaces is overpowering, so overpowering that we dare not move. A great spiritual tranquility fills us, a humbleness and a yearning for the continuance of this immense peace. Our being seems spread through the eternity that we can see. We realize now the full meaning of Einstein's cosmic religion. Cities, empires, states, dreams and ambitions, conflict and confusion are infinitely remote, part of that dream world of that slowly turning globe. So that's an equally hard hit to the psychological solar plexus, and yet somehow lacking. What's missing, I suggest, is the special power of myth that the astronauts of Apollo 8 exploited to superb effect. Genesis is not merely a myth of creation. It is a myth of growing up in the sense described by Salman Rushdie. I made the same point in chapter 10 of my book, The Illusion of God's Presence. From scientific cosmology, I understand that our universe began about 13.7 billion years ago. But the universe as I personally experience it had a much more recent origin, sometime in the mid-1950s. Although I have good documentation for the exact date, my memory cannot specify it, not even to the right year, because it is lost in the haze of my infantile amnesia. If I could remember it, however, I would probably recognize the following as a fairly accurate description of the experience. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Each of us has two creators, one of whom does most of the work of creation, especially in that moment, when the primordial waters move and light first appears. Substitute mother for God in that passage from Genesis, and it seems plausible that these verses allude to the creation of a personal universe, not a cosmological one. Or they may refer to both, much as an image in a dream can have multiple reference. The rest of the first chapter of Genesis strongly suggests a cosmological interpretation, but chapters 2 and 3 are more consistent with the infantile and personal one. Just as a newborn is protected and nourished by its mother, so were Adam and Eve in their paradise of divine origin. In Genesis chapter 3, however, it becomes clear that the metaphor refers not only to early infancy, but also to the whole of childhood and adolescence. Central to the story is the transition from prepubertal innocence to adult sexuality, and with it, the loss of parental nurture, the need to work for subsistence, and the realization that life is short, difficult, and inevitably ends in death. By the time of Apollo 8, my childlike faith in the strange gods of Christianity had already crumbled to dust. As I explained in part 1, a conflict between religious thinking and scientific thinking had long been building in my mind. I was not yet calling myself an atheist, but I could no longer pretend to be a Christian. In April of 1969, as the crew of Apollo 10 trained for their launch in May, I steeled myself for a painful confrontation with my father. As a clueless 15-year-old, I did not handle it well. From the perspective of 4 decades later, in the final chapter of my book, I offered these reflections. If I had it to do over, I would do it differently. I would begin by thanking my father for caring enough about me to take me to church with him every Sunday, which I'm sure he felt was in my best interest. I would tell him that I had admired him all my life. I would thank him for setting a good example for me. I would tell him that I loved him and always would. I would say that I no longer believe that God exists. I would explain that belief is not something you can just turn on or off at will. Astronauts who have seen the Earth from space can never believe that the Earth is flat. At most, they could only pretend to believe it. I would tell him that when I sit in church, I'm only pretending to believe, which I consider an act of hypocrisy. I would remind him that he had raised his son to be honest. I would tell him that children must grow up and become adults who think independently and act independently. Although I was not yet an adult, I was no longer a child. I had begun the transition, and we both had to accept it. That reference to astronauts, by the way, reveals a deep connection in my memory between this familial conflict and the glorious achievements of Apollo. 3 months after this great rift opened up between my parents and me, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. It was a time of pain and joy, of estrangement from the familiar and connection to the new. Science could not fill the emotional void of my adolescence, but it would be the bedrock of my grip on reality for the rest of my life. Although many prayers were offered for the Apollo astronauts, some by the astronauts themselves, it was science and not prayer that took them to the moon and back. The mythical god Apollo was a projection of our humanness onto nature. But Apollo 11 was a human creation that rose from a solid foundation of mathematics, physics, and chemistry. Whether we admitted it or not, Project Apollo proved that we were no longer weak and helpless children of the gods. Humanity had begun its transition to adulthood. What better way to acknowledge this than to read from the myth of Genesis? In conclusion, I'd like to thank my parents for all they did for me and for being my real creators. I thank Salman Rushdie for his wisdom, and I'm grateful to his physicians for saving his life. And I thank Derek for his curiosity and for inviting me here. And I suspect he might have some thoughts or questions about all of this, so I will stop sharing the screen and we can talk about it.
Hey, thank you, John. That was really, really interesting. And I really appreciate you taking us into a personal space like that, opening up and describing your experience, your story, and how impactful that was to you. I like how you took Genesis as well and applied it to like the growing up from adolescence kind of idea.
You know, that's a stunning thing about that story. When I was working on my book, when I was writing my first book, I read the Bible cover to cover, and just starting off, I could see my ideas reflected there. It's a beautiful myth of the human experience of being a child, being dependent, living in a comforting, secure, paradisical existence with your parents, looking out for all of your needs, and showering you with unconditional love if you're lucky enough to have good and loving parents, as most of us do. And then it makes that transition where they start to acquire knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. It was knowledge that got them kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and specifically the knowledge of their own sexuality. So, you know, it's just a beautiful metaphor of coming of age.
Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting the way you painted it. Even with Genesis 1 and the water scene, what came to mind for me was the Gospel of John in chapter 3. The most quoted verse of all time is 3:16. But before that, with Nicodemus, when he says, "You must be born of water and of the Spirit," and the author is at least giving you the hint that the audience would have thought of this as being physically born, because you're born of water, you see. So at least it reflects an idea that people are born. Obviously, your mother is going to have her water break, and then you know the child is born. So it is interesting, and out of everything you have taught before, it kind of all comes in, and it makes sense why the parent and why the mother really specifically is so important in this God understanding, and why people yearn for God, why people believe in God, and why people seek for something more. And it's intuitive. It's kind of built into them.
Yes. Yeah. That's really the essence of my ideas. And of course, those of our viewers who saw my earlier presentations have already heard this, but the main point of it is basically just what you said, that we are born into a situation where we're utterly helpless, utterly dependent on our parents, and especially our mother who feeds us in our first few days and weeks. And just like so many other animals that we can study in nature, our brains are adapted through evolution to cope with this situation. We have an understanding that other human beings, other people exist, that there's another very critical, very important one out there with whom we must make a connection, an emotional connection. So it's only natural to expect that there's something like this going on in the brain. And I try to show in my books that there's actually a lot of scientific evidence for this in the study of the development of human cognitive faculties that go all the way back to early infancy. There's some fascinating experiments on that.
There's a lot. There's a lot of things that you cover. And I want to take one point, because someone might hear this presentation and go, "You said you're an atheist, though, but like, why why would you, I'm going to ask the question as kind of the devil's advocate here. Like, why wouldn't you see the universe as mother or Mother Earth, right? Earth as a living, conscious thing. Why aren't you doing that? Throwing it out there to you.
Well, you know, a lot of people who leave formal religion do exactly that. And they tend to call themselves maybe pantheist, or a lot of them just say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. They don't have a denomination. They don't go to any church meetings, but they still have this feeling that that the universe is somehow mindful and benevolent. They feel at home on planet Earth, especially in nature. And I'm the first to admit that I feel that all the time. I'm a nature lover. I love hiking and going out in the wilderness. I'm a backpacker. I go up to the Sierras every summer with some friends, and I go hiking here. We have a wonderful local park here, not far from where I live. It's coastal sage scrub, not as majestic as the Sierras by any means, but it's, you know, it's beautiful in its own way. And I just feel at home there. It's my home away from home. I'm so comfortable there that I go hiking there at night in the summertime. That now I confess that's mainly because I've lost my heat tolerance in old age. I go there at night because I can't stand to hike there in the daytime. It's so hot. But I'm just comfortable there. And the fact that there are rattlesnakes in the trail doesn't bother me. I just watch where I'm walking, and I'm completely comfortable with the rattlesnakes and the tarantulas and the scorpions and all the weird things you see on a night hike here. I completely identify with that view, that it's easy to have that view. I don't take it that seriously to the point where I think there really is a mind in nature. I've come to the scientific intellectual realization that the universe doesn't have a mind, has no care at all about whether I live or die. It doesn't care whether I step on a rattlesnake. I have to take care of that myself. But I still have the emotional connection that the spiritual but not religious people feel.
You would just define it a bit differently on explaining what you think about those things. Like when someone says Mother Earth, they're spiritual, they're no longer religious because they don't take the biblical text literally as God's word or whatever. They kind of say, oh, well, there's many creation myths out there, and it seems like they're all stemming with similar ideas of some creation of something. And I think it's pretty common sense why a creation myth would come up to me, because we as humans have beginnings, middles, and ends. And of course, wouldn't everything else? It's the same thing about agency, right? We have agency, therefore there's agency everywhere else. So we assume we're the center of all things. We've even heard philosophers in history say, man is the measurement of all things. Well, take that to the bank and you're going to find, well, everything has consciousness too, because we have consciousness, and everything has, some relation to us, and we want to try and project that onto everything else. So I'm with you, right? So like, this is me right now where I'm at. And I think that, I don't draw that Earth itself is conscious the way that we would define consciousness in us or other living things that have a thinking process that are going through the same things that we are. I don't think that dirt or rocks and things like that gets into philosophy. I don't really want to get into too much, but I just want to make the point that we can still speak the same awe and the same language in some ways, but I don't think I think we come to similar conclusions about appreciating something, but like, do you deal with that a lot when you're speaking to people? I have, where they're like, the Earth is conscious, or there's just something out there, and they're just as appreciative of nature and things like that, but they have a complete different system that they kind of frame it up in, and they want to give it properties that I don't think necessarily have, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I do have friends who would fit that description, quite a few of them actually. And one in particular, a dear friend of mine I've known since high school days. He went through a very difficult struggle in his young adulthood when he had chronic fatigue syndrome, and he had it really bad. And that can be debilitating and crushing. And it was for him for a while. And during that time, he came across a book called A Course in Miracles, which is kind of a new agey book that is just the kind of stuff we've been talking about, the spiritual but not religious outlook on philosophy, on the world, on understanding reality. It's a strange book, really, but he came upon it and started reading it and taking it seriously and thinking about the universe as this source of unconditional love. And he went through the little exercises that are suggested in the book, and he started getting better. And he credits that way, that what he calls a spiritual discipline, as helping him in his recovery from chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, my inclination is to think, I don't often say this to him, I probably have at one point or another in my less compassionate moments, but I would tend to say that, okay, that's a coincidence, and a fortunate coincidence for you. And the fact that you have latched onto this belief system is fine. You know, it does you no harm. You don't foist it on anybody else. You don't beat anybody over the head with it. You're not trying to restrict anybody else's rights because of it. You know, it's a very personal thing to him. But he and I are close friends, and we get into intellectual debates, and we used to debate this way of thinking quite a bit. And I would try to, you know, argue the scientific viewpoint. So I was very skeptical, and I would argue my skepticism. He was very spiritual. He'd argue his spirituality. We had a lot of overlap, but we also had differences. And at some point, I just concluded that the debate is not useful. And it's really pointless, because like I just said, I don't really want to talk him out of it. Mm-hmm. It was just a matter of intellectual getting at the truth, you know, and I would take one step further to get at the truth than he is willing to take. That's fine. So I decided it was best just to drop it and not risk hurting his feelings, which I did not want to do. And he may be watching this now, so maybe we'll have a chat about it afterwards. But he is a dear friend and a brilliant writer and a clear thinker. And I can understand why he feels the way he does. So, yes, I have friends like that.
Yeah, I get it all the time. I try to find common ground rather than disagreement. That's what I try to do. I also am glad that I have MythVision to be able to speak my opinions and people can watch them. And, you don't have to listen. But I have to be able to say what I feel and what I think makes the most sense. Because if I had to tiptoe around making everybody, not upsetting or trying to tell them I'm sorry, I honestly think that you're not thinking critically. You're just going with what you've been taught, you were growing up to believe or whatever. I wanted to ask one more question before I get to a super chat here. And of course, if anybody has any questions, throw a super chat up there. I'll be happy to spend some time on it. It helps us out. But my question before we get to one of the super chats that was sent yesterday is in addiction. Mm-hmm. And, my background with heroin, really, it was originally just painkillers. Got hooked on Percocets, and then Percocets turned into oxys, and then they made those illegal because people were overdosing. Then I found oxymorphone, which is like really, really strong stuff. But I was really, really bad off. And at the end, it was to the point where I was dying from heroin. Wow. And most people who get clean off of drugs or alcohol or something try to go down these spiritual routes, AA, NA, which even then that's a spiritual, not as religious, but I won't say that the people in it aren't going beyond their own traditions and their own, what they're supposed to be doing. And they almost act sometimes within the AA groups that I went to, like there's nothing else that works. So their testimony overbears the tradition, which says like, this isn't the only thing that works. Just keep that in mind. They themselves are like, I've tried it all. I'm telling you, you're in the right place because you won't get clean if you go somewhere else. Trust me. And it's like, but your traditions literally say this is not, they're trying to keep from being a cult. Their whole system is to try and prevent from being a cult. But the cult mentality comes in. So I bring up AA and NA because my dear friend Derek Bennett, also, he's an atheist. He wrote a book about how he got clean off drugs and alcohol without God. I started deconverting as I got clean off the heroin. Most people say, I found God, I found a spiritual life, and it really changed me. And for me, as I deconverted, and I actually did the 12 steps. I've done them multiple times, and I relapsed years ago after having a couple years clean. But the 12 steps, what I walked away ultimately getting from it were certain principles. So I practiced certain behaviors, like trying to admit when I'm wrong, confession in a weird way to another human being, not to God. Like that's because you can make a God, they would say things like, you can make God your best friend and he's got a thumbs up to the behavior you have. So they want you to talk to another human being. There's certain things. What do you think is going on? And in what way would you say, like, how come I, for example, got clean and I feel like it's actually helped break me from addiction even more now that I'm not a theist in any way and I don't think in the way that I once thought? Why do you think that is?
One possible explanation is that I think there's something about religion itself which is addicting. And if you're getting off of a drug addiction by turning to a religious addiction, an addiction to both the social interaction that you get at an NA meeting or an AA meeting, or the interaction that you have with a higher power, or believe that you have with a higher power, that actually that kind of thing, the spiritual experience, the feeling of God's presence, there is some evidence that it sets off similar circuitry in the brain as does addiction. I talked about that in the last presentation that I had with you. And that's a complicated story. You can find the details in either that presentation or in my second book, the Phantom God. But the essence of the idea is just that you're doing something similar. You're substituting, a spiritual methadone for your opiate addiction, one opiate for another in a way. And for some people that works. That really does work. They can maintain their life. They can keep going to the AA meetings or the NA meetings. They in moments of weakness or crisis, they can cry out to God for help or whatever, and it's enough for them, and that's great. So I don't want to talk anybody out of that if that's what works for you. But it might not work for some people if it just puts you, or keeps you, I should say, in this addictive frame of mind, and keeps those circuits alive, the seeking, the craving, the insatiable craving. So that's the best I can do to answer that question, I think.
Yeah, and even then I would say I replaced some of that stuff with different hobbies and activities that I enjoy doing. And the behaviors are obviously so divorced from the behavior I once had. I don't even feel like I'm the same guy. Like, it's weird. But it's hard to try and describe that because so many people imagine you can't do it. It's because it is the most intense, darkest. There's not words. I mean, you can put words on a page, but that put you into the framework. There's just no way to know unless you've been there. And it's like, oh, wow. So you imagine like, oh, it's got to be something bigger than this. And so, but yeah, I get that question a lot. And I figure I'd ask you as someone who looks at these patterns and sees this. We did get a super chat. It's a pretty big super chat here by Constellation Pegasus. Thank you for the support. I really do appreciate the love. It says, I love the Apollo capsule next to Apollo, a symbolic image, how understanding electromagnetism, unifying magnetism, and electricity to explain how Zeus and Thor, plus other gods, were not responsible for thunder and lightning. Science eliminating the gods. Physics is everything. Goodbye, Zeus.
Oh, that's a great comment. It triggers one association. I did a little bit of reading. I'm no expert on mythology, but I did a little reading about Apollo in preparation for this talk. And one of the things the thing most people know about Apollo is that he's the god of the sun, that he carries the sun across the sky in his chariot every day. That's what's most commonly known. That's actually not the that was kind of a later thing that was tacked on after the sort of the demise of the Greek civilization, and it was more a Roman thing that was put onto Apollo. But in the ancient Greeks' view of Apollo, he was a god of youth. He was usually depicted, if not always, as a beardless youth, not quite at the transition to adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And he was supposed to be interested in, caring about, and someone you could pray to for help with making the transition from childhood to adulthood. So it just fit beautifully with,
Wow.
by coincidence, with the subject of my talk.
I wonder if Apollo, that kind of notion in the mythology, was in the mind of those naming the spacecraft and, of course, the mission, the Apollo. So it
Oh,
makes
that is a great question. I looked that up, actually. I've forgotten who. There was one person who came up with that name, and I forgot who it was. But he said that the reason he chose Apollo was just that there were so many positive things associated with Apollo in the mythology. Most of what's associated with Apollo is positive. It's not just the growing up thing that I just mentioned, but there were other stuff. He was the god of light and music and dance and poetry, and he also happened to be the god of archery, and some people even believe that he invented the bow and arrow. So he had those associations in the mythology, and I think it was for those reasons. So the inventiveness, the light, the joy, the singing, all of those things made him a good choice for that program, which that's a pretty good argument, I think.
I like what the super chat says. And again, Constellation Pegasus, seriously appreciate that support. That means a lot. It's the idea that I mentioned yesterday. I was interviewed on a show, Brady Goodwin, who was a Christian hip hop artist, actually, a well-known Christian hip hop artist who deconverted just in the last year and a half when COVID hit. And he's now outspoken about his experience. And so he interviewed me. It was really mostly my talk, but he would jump in with some really good stuff. And it's this idea, if I took a category of 10 things that we discovered in the ancient world from these mythologies, and I'm going to count the biblical narrative in, and then we're able to falsify that really is the source for what causes something, like electromagnetism he talks about, or lightning, or volcanoes, right? And we get these 10, and the 10th one is what was before the universe existed, what caused the universe to exist, or what is this, because who knows if it's cyclical in some way or multiverse concept, whatever. My point is the question is something we don't know. So we have these 10 things, and we are able to show that the claims that were once by the gods that were doing these actions, we no longer think thunderbolts are being thrown down by Zeus or Jupiter or whoever. Thor's hammer isn't causing the thunderclap. Volcanoes are erupting now, we know, from tectonic plates moving and causing the crust of the earth to have pressure. The gases of the mantle are now coming up through the earth, and here you have eruptions. We now know natural mechanisms that explain the phenomena. But we get to this one, and it's God of the gaps, God of the gaps. And then what will happen if we then explain the universe? Imagine we were able, I don't know if that's even something we'll ever be able to do, because how do we measure, right? Where you get to a certain wall, right? But imagine we did, and we found it was natural in some sense. We could explain it through some other mechanism. It's almost like God would then move to existence at all could not exist without the existence maker. And it's no matter what you do, God is always going to keep moving. But that's not what God initially ever was. And when you look at how God himself has changed from a corporeal being who had body parts like a man with a large Johnson, he was a god of war. I'm very explicit because this is what academics are writing about, showing the God of the Bible, that eventually the philosophy of Plato and, of course, the Greeks start to impact Jews with Hellenistic thinking, and then God becomes this bigger thing that no one has seen actually, and you start to like philosophize God. I don't know where I'm going with this, but you get the gist. Like, what would you like to say in this?
Oh, gee, so many associations there. First of all, I agree that we don't understand where the universe comes from. It's an unanswered question. Why does anything exist? We don't know.
Yeah.
I'm happy to live with that. I'm happy just to leave it an unanswered question. And if science can someday answer it, which probably won't happen in my lifetime, that would be great. But if it never does, that's okay too. We're here. It's a mystery.
Right.
And isn't that just amazing? That was the kind of thing I think that Bill Anders was talking about. He wanted people to ponder that, to contemplate that. Life, our existence here on Earth in this universe, is just incredibly amazing. It's stunning. It can be almost terrifying. It can be joyful. It can be whatever you want, but it's a stunning thing that most people in our daily lives never think about. So science can bring people to the point of that wonderment, but saying that God did it and saying that, okay, this proves that there has to be a God, because where else would things come from, is completely unsatisfactory to me, because it just moves the question one more step. Okay, then if God created everything and created existence, what created God? Where did God come from?
Right.
And, some people will retort, well, of course, that God is the one thing defined to be the thing that doesn't need to be created. Well, if you can do that trick, why not just do that trick with the physical universe? We define the physical universe as the thing that doesn't need to be created. It doesn't explain anything. It's a pointless way to tackle the problem. But it's a very natural thing to do. And you're reminding me of another thing. Somewhere in my first book, I have a line, I don't know if I can quote it exactly, but it goes something like this. Of the billions of people on Earth who believe in a personal God, I doubt there are few, possibly not even any, who have that belief because they lay awake nights worrying about what preceded the Big Bang. They believe in, and I go on. I do it in a slightly more elaborate way, but the point is that they have that belief really, I think, because of this emotional longing for connection with some loving, powerful being that gives them security, a sense of belonging and safety and nurturance, a parental figure, which, as I have said, I think is that longing is built into our brain. I think that's where it really comes from, and the stuff about, well, worrying about where the universe comes from, they're conflating, I think, the thing I was saying earlier, the distinction between the origin of the universe 13.7 billion years ago and the origin of my personal universe,
I heard you,
which was just a few decades ago by comparison as such. It's back there in the 1950s somewhere. They're conflating those two things, and the myth of Genesis does exactly the same. I think it's both. It's conflating the origin of existence of the universe and the origin of an individual human being going through an individual human life.
It is interesting the way that you painted that, and I've never really tried to process it that way in my thinking to try and see Genesis in relation to what you're describing here. I would say there's probably some things that fall apart, of course, like the idea of them being birthed of a mother. Adam's made from clay. However, it is a parental figure who brings Adam into existence, this God type figure. But looking at that Genesis myth for 1 second, and since you brought it up, it makes me, for a while, I was on the side of this is true. I was taught this and I really believed it. I attached my emotions and that longing to the biblical corpus is accurate and right. It's now that I'm into scholarship that I realize it's actually a polemic. While it is giving you a proposition from the biblical standpoint, or from the Hebrews, if you will, not so sure if they were the Hebrews, or let's just say Judeans at this point, who are writing the Genesis account probably in Babylon or later, I'll say. I wouldn't go any earlier than that. You find that the guys that are the good guys writing in this narrative are the shepherds, those who are non-civilization. They don't like civilization. They're more the shepherd goer types. In fact, they're more the shepherd types even in the Cain and Abel narrative, where the agriculturalist is just not the good guy. The good guy is the one with the flock. And the prophets over and over and over are seen in this light. In fact, you even see a push in later Muslim commentary on Muhammad to make him less a merchant and more a shepherd, because this is the biblical trend. But it's a polemic. Even the idea of building the Tower of Babel and building this infrastructure, this city structure to climb high, is obviously condemned. And so it's anti what we do today. It's anti in any way civilization is today. Yeah.
It's all of it is casting humans as weak and helpless and dependent on God, which is a childlike state. Yeah.
But also God kicks them out.
Yeah.
He doesn't want them to multiply. And it makes me start to think now, since we have bigger lenses we can look through, and we're not stuck with, well, we got to reconcile our faith. It's like, no, I'm looking at the myth that the myth got the myth from, right? And I'm thinking, God, is he such a good guy in this narrative? I'm not so sure that we would say, morally speaking, anachronistically, of course, today with our ethics, like, is this a good parent? Is this a good figure? I don't think it is.
Yeah. There's that, and there's the problem of the doctrine that came out of that myth, the doctrine of original sin.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be one of the strangest things in Christian theology that I can think of, and it's amazing to me that more Christians aren't bothered by it. I'm thinking of. When I was in graduate school, there was a couple of postdocs in the lab. We were getting visiting scientists from all over the world, but mostly from Europe. My professor was well known there. We had one come into the lab from Germany, a young man named Wolfgang. We called him Wolf. And another postdoc arrived at about the same time, who was American and Jewish, and his name was Harold. And Harold confided to me one time that when Wolf arrived, he had this uneasy gut feeling about him because he was a German. He said, he had this feeling that, okay, these were the people who murdered my people, and he just had this unpleasant gut feeling that came to him very quickly, and then he got past that and he started reasoning, and he thought, well, wait a minute, I'm being unfair. Wolf didn't have anything to do with that. He wasn't even born then. I can't blame him for that. And he suppressed that gut feeling that just intuitively came to him. Now the intuition is a tribal intuition. That's another thing that's built into us, this tribal instinct that our tribe is right, and the other tribes that are competing against us are not to be trusted. And you have to look out for them and beware of them and be suspicious of them. They could be dangerous. That's built into us. And that was largely, I think, what triggered that feeling in Harold. But his intellect, his rationality, which is very strong in most scientists and was in him, quickly said, no, wait a minute. That can't be right. That's not fair. That's not justice. It doesn't make sense to blame him for the sins of those ancestors of his. He had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Okay, so if you take that view, which is a perfectly reasonable moral position that I don't think any Christian would argue with, then how can you accept the doctrine of original sin? How can you accept the idea that all humans are condemned to an eternity in hell unless they believe in Jesus. And the reason for that, for them being intrinsically sinful, is that they're inheriting the sinfulness of Adam and Eve. Just makes no sense to me.
It's a weird combination that I find, because Paul kind of lays a groundwork in his letters. Oh, the struggling flesh that we have. Like, so there's this weird philosophical Stoic slash Platonism that we see in some form taking place here, where we're in the lower realms. The higher forms are up there. We're in the lowest form you can be, where matter's heavy, and it's just, this is just flesh. Combining that with a biblical mythology that he has incorporated, that he thinks is literally true, genealogically back to Adam, I imagine that this sets the groundwork for what ends up becoming original sin in Augustine. So,
yeah.
It's
just it's a huge contradiction in Christian theology. It seems to me, anyway. But people, there are many. That's not the only one. But and every religion is full of contradiction when you're not indoctrinated in it. When you see it from the outside, as an outsider, it's much easier to see the contradictions in other people's religion than in the one you were indoctrinated with as a child.
It's really weird you say that, because I was thinking of Marcion. I got a course coming up with Del C. Allison Jr. called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, right? And what I do on MythVision is a lot of Jesus stuff, because I came out of that, right? So I know a lot about it, and I've been really focused on that. I'm expanding that. But, we've asked the question, did the guy even exist? To people thinking, yeah, without a doubt, we think he existed. Others thinking, don't be so confident, I'm not so sure. Here's another explanation, right? Well, I say that to say, like, the doubting whether or not Jesus did certain things or not, and even the move into mythicism, didn't start by atheists like you and me. So in this lecture series that's going to come up, it's going to be a college course. We'll end up selling it and stuff. People will get to hear the process from the Reformation to modern critical historical research. And you can thank the Christians for being skeptical of the Bible and in questioning what Jesus did or didn't do. And in fact, the same thing happens with some rabbis when they start questioning, did Moses really write the 5 books, the Torah? I say that to say, back to Marcion, here you have a Christian. He's grown up. His dad's a Christian. So he grew up in a Christian congregation, but he started going, this God that we're reading about in the Old Testament is bad. Like, this is not a good God. And this God is different than Jesus's God, because Jesus is love. His God is love. This God's bad. You don't need atheists to make this stuff up. Like, it's like, right, you guys are the ones who are figuring it out, and we're just picking up the pieces going, you know what? Marcion's got a point. That's a pretty bad God right there. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah. And so it just makes it all that much easier for us to say, you know what? Probably none of that is true. And life really is better just accepting it the way Salman Rushdie does, If you just accept it as story, it becomes beautiful and in a way that tells you something deep about human nature. Don't look to the ancient myths and the biblical stories for a science textbook or for a history textbook. Look to it for a beautiful piece of literature that says something deep about human nature, about our longings, our obsessions, our peculiarities, our idiosyncrasies, and the Genesis myth just happens to be a great one for deep insights into the human coming of age from childhood to adulthood.
And that's been like a motivation of mine, is to investigate these MythVision, right? See what's myth. And at this point, the meaning of what I titled this whole podcast has evolved in my own thinking of like, wow, you named something that is taking on new meaning for yourself as you're researching, because I am wanting to know what is historical, biblically speaking, in the whole corpus, right? There are prophets that are listed or named that actually did exist historically. where does that line between myth and they didn't exist, or kind of figures that were created to tell a foundation story or something to the Hebrews, the Jews, to what did happen. And then when you get to parts that probably have some historical crossing with the mythology, trying to sift through the two, I have fun doing that as well. But I like what you're saying there, because people will, if we exist, and if, let's say, there was a reset or something and they came across Game of Thrones, just watching Game of Thrones would get someone acquainted, at least within 500 years time, of like, incest is a big no-no. There's a lot of weird things you could find in this episode. They love dragons. Dragons are something cool still. Like, you could evaluate it, and there's crap in there that ethically you and me go, that is dead wrong. But there's a sensation in reading it in your mind or watching it in your mind as a narrative. Obviously, don't practice this, but there's something cool that takes you deep into a low of human experience, and then coming out of that into so there's something cool about the narrative, even though we would say, yeah, don't do that. Don't kill your own family members for power. That guy's
Right.
greedy, like things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think the Bible and all the other holy scriptures should be taken the same way.
Absolutely. Planet Earth, thank you for this super chat. Really, really appreciate the love. It goes a long ways, and it helps us to keep doing what we're doing. And they said religion is premature explanation.
Well, that is a cute turn of phrase. I like that very much. And I think in addition to it being a funny turn of phrase, I think it's there is something deep in it that there's a fascinating book written by Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's about two different ways that the human mind works to solve problems or answer questions or make decisions. One of them is fast and intuitive and comes quickly, and it operates mostly at an unconscious level. And that's what Kahneman calls system one, thinking fast. And then there's the more reflective, slow thinking, rationality, mathematical thinking, logical reasoning, scientific thinking, step by step going through logical decisions. That's the slow thinking, that's system two thinking. And to say that religion is premature explanation is actually very much along the line with Kahneman's idea that religion is one of those things that comes to us intuitively, rapidly, a gut feeling from unconscious sources. It's not something you come to through careful reasoning and laying out a logical argument. That kind of stuff we tend to tack on later after we've already accepted it from the intuition and the feelings and the emotion and the indoctrination and all of that. Then we might start tacking on rationality, and we call ourselves Christian apologists and write books and fill bookstores with that stuff.
Wow. Yeah. If I could comment on this, and then maybe you want a rabbit trail with it too. Religion is premature explanation. I imagine not only scientifically, but socially speaking, there's a combination of things that religion does. And it's not just try to explain existence or origins. It tries to explain behaviors of people. It tries to explain all sorts of stuff. And it's like a one-stop shop to try and explain the world, which is why I think they call it worldview. But I do think it's primitive. And it's interesting that if I have 3 kids, we would have had 5. My wife had 2 miscarriages, but I have 3 boys. And every time they went from the pacifier stage, bottled pacifier stage, to the cup, giving them a cup to drink from, they went through this extreme fit that I'm doing them wrong. I'm a bad parent. Like, why are you doing this to me? And I remember that, like, feeling bad, like, just give them the pacifier sometimes. And they're like, no, hold on. You got to stop. You need to get the cup because your teeth, you're going to mess your teeth up in this process, all of this stuff. But it was for his his own, well-being that I was trying to do this to get him out of the phase. And I imagine the same can be said about ideas. And you don't have to just say religion. Religion is something that's brought up here, but like any ideas that were taught, your parents teach you something, whatever it is, religion, politics, any of this stuff, and you come with something better or something that corrects the earlier thing. And there is this reluctance, and I like to call them apologists. I was there. I was defending an ancient model that I thought was for all time. This is the truth, capital T, and it should be the thing that tells us how to live in all facets of life, in everything that we should do. And while I think there are certain things you could see that are wise from ancient religions, whatever they may be, like there are going to be new models of things that I think are going to replace or be better. And I imagine the hissy fits that we get, the emotional reactions that come from many apologists, fit that kind of parallel there that I'm trying to analogize of my kids not wanting to, because it sucked for me when I tried to go from the apologist Christian and transitioned. And I had to do it very slowly. I could not all or nothing go that transition.
It was the same for me, actually. My transition to non-belief or free thinking was a very gradual thing. It took years, really. For me, it started probably about a year before I had that split with my parents over whether I was going to church or not. I was still going to church, still pretending to be a Christian, but I felt that the God described and taught in Sunday school can't possibly be the real one. We're told that Jesus, we're close to Christmas now, the arrival of Jesus that we're told at Advent, the Christmas story, is that, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. This is the Messiah. The world's going to change. He's bringing peace on earth. But where is that? What it really brought was the Crusades. That's not peace. That's war.
Yeah.
It brought the Reformation and all the wars that flowed out of that. It brought the troubles in Northern Ireland. That can't be right.
You could even add it brought the annihilation of, Native Americans.
Yes.
It brought so many things.
Yes, exactly.
South America as well,
Right. So as a 14-year-old, I could see that much, and I was thinking, maybe there is a God, and maybe it even is a loving God, but this Christian story can't be right. And if it's a loving God, then maybe it's not omnipotent, or it doesn't pay much attention, or doesn't care that much, or I don't know. I can't explain it. It doesn't make sense to me anymore. And so I was in this weird state for at least a year where I sort of believed there had to be a God because something had to create the universe, but nothing else about it made much sense. And then for another year or so after I had that coming out to my parents, I still, I just gradually moved to thinking more and more that none of this religious worldview makes any sense. But what does make sense is the scientific approach to understanding reality. And it doesn't answer every question. It doesn't claim to answer every question the way religions do claim to answer every question. It leaves a lot of things unanswered, and you just have to live with that. But by God, it works. It put human footprints on the moon, right? Religion never accomplished anything remotely like that. Jesus supposedly said, when he was asked by his disciples, they were talking about the end times and how they're going to be false prophets, and they asked him, how can we tell the true prophets from the false prophets? And Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. Well, by accident, that little passage in the New Testament actually contains a pearl of wisdom. You can tell if a worldview and an approach to understanding reality is true, and I'll put that word in quotes, by how well it works at understanding physical reality. What does it produce? we would not be having this conversation through this device you're staring at,
Right.
were it not for modern scientific technology. That thing rests on a foundation of mathematics and physics and chemistry and quantum physics and electronics and math and computer science. There's a whole bunch of stuff behind this device we're using to do this. And it didn't come from religion. And if this had existed, if someone had seen this 200 years ago, they would swear it was supernatural. It had to come from a god. It had to be from some being with immense magical powers to create such a thing. But it's not a miracle. It's marvelous, but it's not a miracle. It's the work of science. So that made that, and like I said in the opening talk there, it was largely the space program and all that went with that got me thinking more and more. Okay, look, I can't answer every question. I can't understand everything about the universe. Let's just concentrate on physical reality. And science is doing really, really well at explaining that. So I'm just going to go that way. And I did, and I'm really happy that I did.
So two things that come to mind is the debate you recently had, debate discussion that you had over on capturing Christianity. I want to get your thoughts about that debate. I watched some of it. I wasn't able to watch it all while I was working here at the house. And the second thing that you said, and I'd like to get how you would respond to this question. And this is, I've had some very good friends, smart people who are into deep dives into consciousness and science, but also into open-mindedness of other alternative explanations for consciousness. Like, where do we go with this stuff? Who say, well, to me, I couldn't be a naturalist. They would say, to me, I couldn't be a naturalist because naturalists assume all there is the natural world. And here you are, this evolved primate on the spinning ball in space, like absolutely nothing compared to the scope of all existence there is. And you're going to sit here and assume all there is natural things. It's egotistical, they would say. It's what would be a derogatory term to call it? I mean, I'm trying to use that. Like, the point is
arrogant, maybe? Is that the word?
Arrogant. It's so arrogant to assume that you should be a naturalist when we have the faintest idea of the totality of existence that is out there. To pretend naturalism actually explains this, why would you even draw that conclusion?
Gee, that strikes me as sort of ass backwards. For me, what seems arrogant is the traditionally religious view, that humans are the center of the universe. Our Earth is the center of the universe, and humans are the focus of divine attention, or of God's attention. God only brought the universe into existence so that he could bring us into existence. He wanted us. He wanted relationships with us. That's all he cared about. And all these galaxies out there, that's just a side effect. That's kind of irrelevant. Even Francis Collins, whom I greatly admire as a scientist, even Francis Collins says that. He believes that. He's not trying to be arrogant. He's making the point that he believes in evolution, and he's trying to get his fellow Christians who are reading his book to accept the reality of evolution. Because as a biologist, Francis Collins knows the abundant, overwhelming evidence that evolution is true. This biology makes no sense except for it having been the product of evolution. So he knows that, and he's trying to explain that, and he's trying to say that, okay, you don't need to discard evolution if you want to believe in God. He said you can accept that evolution is God's way, God's mechanism of creating humans, because God wanted to have fellowship with humans.
Right.
And that last part is a bit arrogant, I think.
Right.
When you compare tiny us on this tiny speck of dust to this vast universe of countless galaxies.
So the question, I guess, to get to hitting home is, you see it backwards, and that would be a backwards position that take is, But would it be fair? And I'm going to give you my thoughts, and then you tell me how you might want to rephrase it or address it or correct it, whatever. I mean, what we know, what we can observe, what we can test, measure, etc., through the empirical data is all we can know and test and observe. And if there is something out there, I'm not going to make a hunch or a guess or assume or assert it is there. I'm going to start with the principles that we can observe and test, because how often have we made that assumption and been wrong? How often have we assumed things were this way because of a feeling or an instinct, or gosh, it's just so big, it's overwhelming. There must be something much beyond what we can comprehend that is out there. I don't think that starting with that is the right way. I'm going to start with the tools that I can know, and assuming anything else exists beyond that is imaginative, even though it's plausible. It's not like it couldn't be. It's just, why aren't we starting with what we can know and then like leaving other things open for maybe one day we'll find out. Maybe one day it'll actually, make itself known to us, or our science will advance and we'll go, we actually found out metaphysics. There's more to metaphysics than we thought there was, or whatever it may be, and draw those conclusions. Do you see where I'm going with this? Like, starting with what we can know, then work outward, rather than, man, it's just too big, and I can't believe you're a naturalist. Like, I can't believe that you're starting with that.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because it goes to a very important point that I want to make, and I wanted to make it in the debate that you were referring to that I had the other day on the Capturing Christianity site. And I don't feel that I adequately made the point that there are different ways of defining what it means to know something. We have a sort of a colloquial way of describing knowing something or being certain about something. And for most people who are not trained as scientists, it's a feeling of knowing more than anything else. It's an emotion, in a sense. It's an intuitive feeling that, oh, I just know this is true. It just feels right. Most people use that a lot. Now, in some circumstances, they don't. In very specific circumstances, they don't. If they're worried about their bank balance, they don't trust their intuition that, oh, I feel today like I probably have $1,000 in my checking account.
Right.
They're more likely to go to the bank and ask for a statement or something, so they'll know exactly how much they have. But I'll give you a specific
have
example.
Apps today, Dr. Wathey. I'm just kidding. Yeah. This is right. Telling your age. No, go ahead.
It is. I'm giving away my age. I'll give you a specific example. On Facebook, I was interacting a few years ago with someone from my high school. And the subject we were talking about was this so-called Pizzagate conspiracy theory, that, someone was torturing innocent children in the basement of this pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and Hillary Clinton was behind it, and George Soros was behind it, and all these Democrats were behind it, and so on. It's a vast conspiracy. Okay, that was Pizzagate. And I was trying to reason with this person, and he was saying, yeah, okay, I can see that, but I just feel that something about it is true. And I could not get past that. He relied on emotion and gut feeling. He was convinced that Hillary Clinton was evil, and this story was about her doing something evil, and so it made perfect sense that that's probably true. That's a dangerous way to go through life, basing your assessment of what's true, your idea of knowledge, on gut feelings and intuition. But that's what comes easily to us. That's what comes naturally to us. What's difficult is the scientific way of knowing, where knowledge is not an all or nothing thing. There's not a binary false or true. There's a continuum of probability. Every bit of knowledge is a probabilistic thing. And we establish confidence in something being true by doing experimental tests. If you want to know something about physical reality, that the moon is at a certain distance from the Earth, for example, we can actually do some some measurements using telescopes and do some mathematical calculations and see how it kind of wobbles in its appearance and carefully track its orbit across the sky. And we can work out about how far away it is, and in fact, quite accurately how far away it is. That takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time and patience and rationality and careful reasoning and measuring. That's the scientific way of knowing it. It takes training, it takes effort. Most people can't just easily do it. But that's what gives us the wonders of modern scientific technology. That's what's expanded our lifespans. That's what's giving us this device we're looking at. That's what's put footprints on the moon, as I like to say. It's given us a much better way of life, and it wouldn't be able to do that, right? But modern technology would not exist but for the fact that scientific ideas of what is true and what is false really do reflect reality. That's why scientific technology works. Scientific ideas are in good agreement with reality, not perfect agreement. We're always learning that we're getting closer and closer to the truth. We're always willing to refine our ideas, our theories, our hypotheses. Like Newton's laws of motion, we're really, really good at predicting the motion of the planets, and you could chart where they would be against the background of the stars very accurately, except for the planet Mercury. Planet Mercury, when that was studied very carefully, it deviated. It didn't quite follow Newton's laws of motion the way it should, until Einstein refined Newton's laws of motion with his general theory of relativity. And then the prediction of the motion of Mercury was spot on. So we're always doing that. We're always refining. We're always learning. We're always willing to admit that our knowledge isn't complete. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do right now. And I just love that. I love that approach to understanding reality. It's humble, I think. Quite the opposite of being arrogant. You're being humble when you admit you don't know everything.
And can you say that and say you're a naturalist?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'd have to say that. Yeah. And when I say that, I'm not making the claim that there cannot possibly be anything supernatural, like a God that exists somehow outside of space and time and created the universe. That's possible. But unless that God interacts with physical reality, we have no way of detecting it. We have no way of knowing. And you can make up many, many different versions of how some supernatural thing, some supernatural supernatural force that doesn't even have a brain, doesn't even have a mind. You can make up all kinds of fantasies, mythologies, whatever. We have no way to distinguish one from the other. We have no way to tell which is more or less likely to be true. So why waste our time with that? Let's concentrate on the things in nature in front of us where we can distinguish what's more or less likely to be true. That's what I mean when I say I'm a naturalist.
Okay, and we will definitely be getting to your capturing Christianity debate and getting into this very topic more. But I have some super chats, and I don't want to leave them hanging too long. So I really appreciate the support. JC, thank you for showing up, and of course the super chat. Dr. Wathey, your work is brilliant and innovative. Thank you. How can we improve secular science education to engage more kids and inspire all, as well as gain knowledge? Seems so many get turned off instead.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. That's a very good question. I'm not an educator, but what I would say, but what comes to mind for me is getting kids to do experiments in the classroom. Don't just describe experiments. Give them a puzzle to solve, and give them the tools to do some experimentation on their own. Don't even tell them what the answer is or should be. Just point them in the right direction and give them the means. And when they're going astray, you might give them some hints or whatever, but get them active in actually trying to solve puzzles by using the scientific method. That would be my suggestion. And it's a harder way to design a course. You can't just write a textbook and throw it at the kid and throw it at the teacher and say, do that. You actually have to design experiments and, make little plastic things and chemicals or whatever. It takes effort and time, and it's harder for the teachers, but it's more fun and more engaging for the students. So I would strongly urge that.
Thank you so much.
It's my best suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you. Planet Earth, thank you for the super chat again. Thoughts on past brain evolution, reptile, primate, and the future of transhumanism, AI impact, modern tech impacting human brain patterns? Thanks.
Ooh, interesting question. Yeah, that's a fascinating one. A bunch of associations spring to mind. First of all, the contrast between reptile brains and primate brains. My wife, I'm allergic to dogs and cats, so my wife and I, during the years when we had pets, we had reptiles for pets. We had an iguana at one time, and we had some chameleons at one time. So we had a personal experience with the reptilian brain, and I think the reptiles have been given a bad rap by associating the reptilian brain with sort of unconscious, mindless violence. That has sometimes been the interpretation of the popular interpretation of the reptilian brain idea, that the human barbarity comes from the reptilian part of our brains. I've never met reptiles that were nearly as violent as humans are. So I think that's something that's something that comes actually from our sociality, our willingness and even sometimes craving to make war on each other comes from the fact that we are highly, highly social animals and highly tribal animals. But that's getting a bit afar from this question. The future of transhumanism. I think it's fascinating the way artificial intelligence is evolving right now, the way the way artificial brains, artificial intelligence is making advances. It's stunning to me. It's actually outstripping what I would have thought we would accomplish by this point in time. I don't know if I mentioned it in this show or not. I might have mentioned it in one of your earlier talks, but there's a fascinating puzzle in artificial intelligence. Not in biology, called the protein folding problem. How do protein molecules assemble themselves in three-dimensional shapes? Fascinating thing. I worked on it myself for many years. Artificial intelligence has solved that problem. It happened in 2021. So just a couple of years ago, 1 year ago. So that's a huge achievement. That was just stunning. And Nobel Prizes will be given out for that. It hasn't happened yet, but it should be, it will be. That was an amazing thing. We're going to see more of that. We're going to see artificial intelligence do things that will make your jaw drop. Now, as for transhumanism, my understanding of that word is that it's the idea that you could somehow put your consciousness into a supercomputer of some kind and live forever. Or another version of it I've heard is that the replacement of human organs, failing human organs, will get better and better. Our lifespans will be extended by this, and eventually we'll be able to replace the human brain as just another organ that we can replace and keep extending human life, possibly indefinitely. I doubt that will ever happen. And even if it were possible to do it, even if it were possible to somehow upload your consciousness into a computer of some kind, what you would be doing would be creating another you. You'd be creating another instance of you that has all of your memories, but it isn't you. and when your physical brain died, your experience of reality would vanish. Your consciousness would evaporate and you'd be gone, and you'd be just as dead as whether or not that copy had been made. The copy would go on, and anybody who interacted with it would would think that it was you. It would have the same memories you used to have. It would say the same kind of jokes you used to tell, but it wouldn't be you. Those are my associations to that question.
Thank you so much for that. And then JC, again, thank you. I would love to see a conversation between Ed Yang and Dr. Wathey about other species, amazing ways of sensing. Derek, please host. Too many humans are arrogant and rapidly destroying biodiversity. Such bad stewards.
Oh, I really identify with that last sentiment. A large part of my last chapter in my first book was about that very thing, that we're being bad stewards of this world we're so lucky to inhabit. And as for other species and their amazing ways of sensing, I agree with that completely. It is truly astounding what other animals can do. There are fish that find their way around by sensing electric fields in the water around them. Bats can sense objects around them, their surroundings, little tiny insects flying some distance away entirely by their sense of hearing and by echolocation. It must, you try to project yourself, or at least I do, into the mind of a bat that's out there flying around trying to catch insects, and you imagine the chirps, the ultrasonic sound going out and coming back, and you see it would be I can only imagine it as being to them, feeling to them like my sense of vision feels to me. I get this rich tapestry of my surroundings through vision, and color and shape and light and dark, and all sorts of things come to me through vision. An equally rich image, I think, comes to a bat through hearing, and it's something we just can't quite wrap our minds around. Fascinating question.
Yeah, and I wrote this down, so I will look into trying to contact them and see, maybe there's some books too that we can discuss of their work or whatever they have, and we'll go from there. Thank you, JC. Really appreciate all the support. So if you want to super chat your questions, feel free to do so. I'll be happy to get them before we end up leaving today. Dr. Wathey, you did this debate on capturing Christianity, and I feel like things would circle back to like a fundamental difference on method here and what you guys assert or assume to be the case about certain things. Tell us in your own words what you thought about that debate, and then maybe you want to stillman what the opponent or the opposition was saying, and then like where you think you're correct in your approach.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience for me. I should probably say, first of all, I should make the disclaimer, and maybe I should have made this when I was there. I don't consider myself a good debater. I don't think well spontaneously. When somebody throws something at me, a question or whatever, or a statement that just comes out of left field and I wasn't prepared for it, I'd never thought about it before, it seems strange to me just because it's so alien to the way I think, that I'm like a deer in the headlights in that situation. So I'm not a good debater in that way. But and I may have looked like a deer in the headlights. I felt like it anyway during some of that talk, because my partner in that conversation, Tyler, who's McNabb, who's a very interesting guy, very smart guy. I admire him and respect him a lot. He does think about these things very differently than I do, and he's taken a different approach, mainly the approach of a philosopher. And of course, he could speak for himself much better than I can speak for him. But it's hard. Again, it's hard for me to put myself in his way of thinking, just because I've gone off in a different direction. We've diverged in our approaches to trying to understand reality. He's very much into what I call system 2, or what Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist, calls system 2, the rationality, the formulating precisely made arguments using the rules of logic. That's what philosophers do. They come up with starting principles or premises and try to build from those using a logical argument, following certain rules to reach a conclusion. Now, Christian philosophers especially are focused on not just the general question of how do we get to truth, so much as, given that I believe in Jesus as my personal savior, how do I show that this is reasonable? How do I show that this is rational? How do I show that this is not irrational? And so they go through these motions of building an argument. Now, he was trying to make the case in our discussion that, and he's tried to do this in one of his papers too that he let me read, that maybe you don't even need to do that. Maybe a religious person, a Christian, let's say, can have confidence in their belief in God based solely on an intuition that comes to them, what the philosophers of religion call sensus divinitatis, which is Latin for the sense of the divine. The sense of God's presence is how I would describe it in English, or maybe even better, what I would call the illusion of God's presence. That's how I put it in the title of my book, because I think it is an illusion. But he was trying to say that maybe it's not an illusion. Maybe this is something we can trust because it comes to us from our cognitive faculties, from our brains, from our minds. And if our cognitive faculties are reliably aimed at truth, this was the phrase he would use, a qualifier he would use. If our cognitive faculties are functioning properly and reliably aimed at truth, then we should be able to take this as a reflection of reality, that these feelings that a God must exist must be evidence or proof that a God does exist. And the point I was trying to make to him was, well, wait a minute. First of all, our cognitive faculties, our perceptions, our senses are not reliably aimed at truth. They are aimed at reproductive success. Okay, we are the products of evolution, and our brains have been molded by evolution for reproductive success, and which does not always lead us to the truth. And I tried to give some examples of that. One of them is how we can see faces in the clouds or faces in strange rock formations on the surface of Mars when there are no faces there. The faces exist only in our brains because our brains have been shaped by evolution to interact with other human beings whose facial expressions are extremely important to us. And so for our reproductive success. So he actually brought up another one that I didn't get a chance to point out, but it was what's called hyperactive agency detection. That human beings, when we're, say, as hunter-gatherers walking through the savanna of Africa in a grassy area, if we hear a rustling in the grass a short distance away, we have a very strong tendency to assume there's a live being, an agent with a mind, a conscious agent causing the grass to rustle, and take action accordingly and respond accordingly. And that does very much improve our reproductive success, because if you make that assumption and the thing in the grass is a leopard, you're much more likely to leave offspring and have those genes persist in the population if you make that assumption that there's something there that you need to pay attention to and maybe avoid.
Right.
But if you have the opposite tendency, you have the tendency to think that there's just, the wind blowing the grass, and make the false conclusion that there's a leopard there, you haven't done yourself any harm. And so this tendency to be oversensitive, hypersensitive to the presence of other agents is something that's built into our cognitive system through evolution. And that's another example where an intuition is aimed at reproductive success, not truth finding. But,
and you combine in your research, I want to get back to something he said, but you combine the ideas that you just described here with the fact that there's this, naturally we yearn for our mother. And if you combine kind of this idea of the reproductive success, like, hey, I want to make sure I get crops next year, like you have a weird superstition that develops out of these naturalist or evolutionary processes that help you to survive. And you assume, hey, look, I also have this God over here and he's clapped thunder at me before. And, you know, my parents also are saying, watch out for the God in the sky or on the mountain or whatever. We need to make sure that the gods are happy because these are forces and powers that are beyond our comprehension and beyond us that impact our survival. We're going to start combining some of these things that become systematic in what we would call worldview or religion. And I think that makes the most sense because we at least have something we can test, we can observe, we can actually come to the bottom. What he said in the debate, and I wanted to get your comment on that, I kept hearing him say a couple times, was, well, science itself is self-defeating because it can't prove itself. It's you have to assume or assert something to begin with. Specifically, he was even using the argument of like, well, we could be brains in a vat, or all creation could be 5 minutes ago with false memories inserted into our minds. Really, this live stream, an hour and 51 minutes? Are you kidding me? Everything was created 5 minutes ago, and you can't prove that isn't the case, or the problem of other minds. All of these things get thrown into the blender, and you were trying to find common ground of like, let's go ahead and just assume here that like existence is this, the reality is, other minds exist, these type of things where we can't prove it. And he was trying to say your worldview collapses, crumbles, because you're assuming empirical inferences to try and come to conclusions when you can't prove your starting point without a shadow of a doubt. You see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I see what you're trying to get at. And I don't feel that I gave him a really good satisfactory answer during that debate. What I would say now, with a little bit of hindsight and some time to think about it, is actually what I said earlier in this conversation, which is that, okay, yes, I cannot prove that the universe was not created just 5 minutes ago, or that I'm just a brain in a vat and you don't exist and this computer in front of me doesn't exist. I'm being fed these false signals by some malevolent alien thing that has my brain in a vat. These are untestable ideas. There's no way I can disprove it. And they are equally untestable. There's no way I can say one is more plausible than another. So I don't waste my time with that. What I do instead is I take my impressions of reality that I get through my senses and just take that as, okay, let's just assume what seems to be real sort of is real. And it may be that my senses are not perfect, that they don't give me a perfectly accurate or complete view of what's going on around me or how it works. But maybe it's enough that if I just probe it a little more, if I isolate one little aspect of reality, like suppose I'm trying to understand how objects move. Can I just take one little thing, I'll make a ball of clay and I'll make it real smooth and as spherical as I can, and I'll put it on a smooth surface and I'll nudge it and study how it moves. If I do that, I can eliminate a lot of confusing factors by simplifying the problem. Let's try that and just see where it takes us. That is what science does. And yes, we might be a brain. One of us might be a brain in a vat. But let's assume that the universe is real and see how far we can get with it. And I would say that we have gotten astoundingly far. That scientific knowledge has grown exponentially. And when I say that, I'm not meaning it in the casual way that exponential growth phrase is misused so much in common language these days. What exponential growth means is that the rate of growth is proportional to the amount present. So the more something increases, the faster it grows. That's what exponential growth is. And science does that. Science is growing that way because the more we learn, the more questions we have. So we get past certain questions. We satisfy ourselves with the answers to some questions. But in doing so, we create 10 new more questions that we hadn't even thought of before. And that's why science grows exponentially. And our ability to manipulate the physical universe to our own ends, what we call scientific technology, that grows exponentially also. And, 100 years ago, well, let's say, my father was born a little more than 100 years ago. He was born just a few years, 10 years? 10 years after the Wright brothers flew their first airplane. He lived to see men walk on the moon. That's how fast technology advanced during his lifetime. And it's still going on. And the kind of technology we have in front of us, computer technology, artificial intelligence, that is growing exponentially. So I'm very optimistic about where that will take us if we don't destroy our planet with global warming first.
Yeah.
But
or
anyway,
or destroy ourselves,
Yeah, or destroy ourselves. But technology, scientific technology is a double-edged sword, right? It gives us immense power, and we can improve human flourishing with it, and we can destroy ourselves with it. But the fact that it is so powerful is proof that the scientific method has a close correspondence with reality. So that's my answer to Tyler. Okay, you might be able to argue through philosophical rules that my worldview has no solid foundation or is self-defeating. But we gave you modern technology. We gave you the modern world through science. And to my mind, that is proof that our worldview is in close harmony with reality. We are about as close to reality in our thinking as humans can now get.
So you were just trying to find a fundamental foundation of we got to start with reality somewhere and go from there. And I think I heard him say scientism, like the belief in scientism. And I don't know if that's a pejorative or, some.
Yeah. That go ahead.
No. Tell me. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that word is thrown around a lot, and I find it kind of disturbing, or combination disturbing, annoying, silly. I don't know quite how to dismiss it, but I do pretty much dismiss it because most of the time when people use it, it is intended as a pejorative, and it's used in a few different pejorative senses. Some people from the humanities will say, well, you scientists say that the scientific method is the only way to truth. But what about music or art or literature or drama? What about the humanities? Don't these have something to tell us? Aren't these alternative ways to truth? And when you say that science is the only way to truth, you're just doing scientism, right? So that's one way it's used. Another way it's used is that science can only deal with a certain limited aspect of reality. It can only deal with, it has to stay within its proper domain. And if it tries to get outside of its proper domain and say something about religion, the way my books do, then that's scientism, because you're now stepping on my turf. You're exceeding your legitimate boundaries. That's another way that scientism is sometimes used. There are probably a few others, but what I said to Tyler was that, we scientists don't worry about that. It does not come up in conversation when we're doing science. When we're sitting around the lab thinking about what to do next for an experiment, trying to come up with ways we can answer some question, never does anybody say, oh no, we can't do that, because that would be scientism. We'd be trampling on somebody else's turf if we did that. And so my own feeling is it's just a way of a defense mechanism that some people use when they feel that their own little precious thing in their worldview is being in some way threatened by science. They don't like that, and they charge us with scientism when that happens. For the people in the humanities, the artists and the musicians and so on who say that they have a way of knowing too. I would agree with them. I would say, yes, you have a way of knowing something, or at least, maybe I should put it this way, a way of enhancing our understanding. Maybe knowledge is not quite the right word for it, but a way of enhancing our understanding of human nature. You have a way of bringing beauty into the world, but also bringing insight into human nature, into our longings, into our emotions, into our drives, into our way of thinking. And in literature, stories do that, and myths do that, as we were talking about earlier. The myth of Genesis has deep, profound myths, deep, profound insights into human nature, and especially that difficult transition from childhood comfort and security into adult insecurity and working hard for subsistence and knowing that the end is death. That's beautifully captured in the Genesis myth.
It's kind of interesting too, as we learn more about how to deliver children, can you imagine the day when women can give birth with no pain?
Yeah.
Imagine that happens. Did you just turn that God's curse into something like that doesn't exist anymore? If we get to that point, I'm just making the point. Like, do you really think the authors of this book foresaw the day women could give, birth and potentially without pain? Don't think that they were thinking that. Just something to think about. But there's a lot. Yeah, I feel like it's trying to discourage people from using a scientific method to try and gauge the question of God, really, ultimately, is the issue I see, or existence of something beyond there. And in fact, I've seen many in the chat. I do want to get this super chat here real quick, but I'm going to come back to many in the chat that have made this kind of remark that I'll get your opinion on. Dalai Lama, good to see you here. Thank you for the support, super chat, and the Patreon, the whole nine. I really do appreciate you. As a 35-year practicing scientist, I resonate deeply with Dr. Wathey's perspective. Deep respect.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, seriously, this is the actual Dalai Lama, by the way. I'm just kidding. I really appreciate you showing up. So in the chat, we've seen people say, Art, you're a naturalist, right? We brought up the term scientism, naturalism. Well, how, as a naturalist, can you explain eternity? And how does everything exist eternally past, right? How can you explain that in naturalism? And you can flip that question around, right? Like, they answer it with their theism or their version, whatever it might be, of God, that can last forever in some way, without ever like actually being able to test, observe, and know what is this thing that you're trying to say goes on forever. And I wanted to bring up Spinoza because the name Spinoza also popped up in the chat earlier, where it seems like nature itself is divine itself. So the question is if that is the case, if we wanted to marry the two, let's say, nature itself would be eternal. I don't know how you would want to coin this. Maybe I'm misrepresenting Spinoza here, but can you tell us how your naturalism would explain eternity, something always existing in the natural world, or in some sense, there had to be some substance of something that has always existed?
The short answer is no, I can't explain that. I don't think science can yet explain that.
Right.
And I just have to tolerate it. I have to live with some unanswered questions. It fascinates me, and I think that in probing subatomic physics, particle physics, we get closer and closer to understanding the processes that were going on in the early universe, when the universe was extremely dense and went through this abrupt transition, the Big Bang, where space and time unfold and expand, and particles start to acquire mass, and beyond a certain point, our physics is very good at explaining everything that we see past that point. But going back in time, we reach a brick wall. We reach a place where are what we can measure and what we can explore with the methods of science today just can't go there. We not necessarily in principle, but in practice. We don't yet have the techniques to do that. Maybe we never will. I don't know. But there are limits to our knowledge in that way right now, practical limits. As for eternity, I just have to mention a funny cartoon I saw on Facebook not too long ago. Shows a person, an angel actually, a person presumably who just recently died and is now an angel sitting on the cloud, and he's sitting there with his angel wings, and the caption reads, "I wish I'd brought a magazine," because he's bored. You know, after the first few trillion years have gone by, you might think life in heaven would start to get a little boring.
Right.
So the idea of eternity is kind of an odd thing, or especially the idea of eternal life. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around that.
There's all sorts of issues that come up. Yeah. And I just thought about that because it's that eternal God always existed, always was, and never had a beginning question that gets turned around. Why couldn't you apply that to whatever existence is? And then just say, in some way, these properties have always existed, maybe recycling, maybe beyond my comprehension of not knowing what it is. And it's constant expanding of things that I don't even know what this is ultimately. I'm an ape trying to rise and figure out, how do I get my next meal? How do I reproduce? But I am trying, since I have time on my hands, and I think that's why we're able to discover things we are now. We're not having to fight so hard to survive, hunter-gatherer or agriculturalist, depending on out there having to be the ones that are working in the field. We're able to observe and do these things and test things and analyze. But I just find that it's a tool, and what we're doing and how we're approaching it is we're making a guess that maybe nature is it. The natural world and what we see and can observe and test is it. And why would I assume are goblins real? Are leprechauns real? Are unicorns real? Are name the god, the demon, the jinn, the ghost, the whatever, Satan, you name it, right? There are people who assume those things are real. And there might be natural explanations for why those assumptions are there, from the cultural context, maybe an evolutionary context, where I've heard some people think dragons may even come from, or at least the Komodo dragon or some form of it was eating humans in Africa at certain points. And is this a remnant of an evolutionary, real dramatic scene between the survival of a certain tribe of humans and the dragon? Don't know, just saying. I think of these things and I go, wouldn't it be a little more honest and humble to assume, let's start with what we can know and assume if there is something else out there, until we have that, I'm not going to go, it's out there. There's this thing out there.
Yeah, that's very much the scientific attitude. Very much. I agree with that.
That's where I'm at today. I stop assuming and asserting or hoping or guessing and just going with what I can know and ascertain, then going there.
Yeah. I think that's the most honest way to approach reality, and that does trigger one more thought for me, which is that I think everyone who's struggling with the kinds of questions you deal with in your podcast should ask themselves what it means to be a truth seeker. And for me, what it means to be a truth seeker is to be willing to admit that you're wrong about anything, that no belief is sacred, that you have to be willing to abandon anything if the evidence says otherwise. If it's some precious, beautiful scientific hypothesis you've come up with that's just elegant, mathematically elegant, and so elegant you look at it and you think, that has to be right. It's just so beautiful. How could it not be right? And then you do the experiment to test it, and it turns out not to be right. You have to accept that and move on. Francis Crick, actually, I knew Francis Crick years ago. He's one of the two people who discovered the structure of DNA. He was at the Salk Institute when I was there, and he was telling once a story of some hypothesis that he and someone else had come up with about how the encoding of amino acid sequences in proteins was done in DNA. Some formula for translating, for having some combination of codons in the DNA correspond to amino acids in a protein sequence. It was an arcane thing, but he had a very beautiful, elegant, mathematically precise solution to this, which was very efficient too. It was informationally compact and just beautiful. And he said the experiment showed that it was absolutely wrong. And he just had to toss it and scrap it and never write about it, and write about what was real, what the experiments did show was correct. So
I got a question, and then we'll wrap things up here unless someone super chats before we do. And I hope people go get his books. But Dr. Wathey, in the field of New Testament studies, for example, I've explored scholarship in this area quite well. Predominantly people who are invested in researching and doing this are people who are faithful, right? People who are of the faith, predominantly because they have a motivated reason to want to learn and go deeper into their faith and their worldview. So they study, and they're in higher educational settings, they are using methods, historical methods, and they're being taught, I think, well, in terms of knowing when you should probably draw certain lines. I do feel like sometimes there's a bending of those methods to try and fit some of the people's conclusions. However, on MythVision, we've really taken pride in trying to get and highlight the academics who I think they're trying to be as honest with the data. Oftentimes they don't have that worldview that they need to defend, or they need to reconcile the reality of what they find in the text to their faith. So therefore they're not doing any apologetics the best that they can. Mm-hmm. And so I say that to say, like, good historical methodology, they'll walk away, I don't know. The text says this or whatever, rather than we should know because the text says they saw Jesus, or they believed Jesus rose from the dead. There's good reason to believe he actually rose from the dead, without factoring in like other figures who die and are brought back by gods or healed from illnesses, sicknesses, you name it. And like, you don't believe that stuff's happening, but you're going to go over here and believe this. I'm painting a picture here for you in the academic setting of New Testament to say there are a growing trend of non-Christian academics. And there've been that, but like really it's growing now, from Jewish, atheist, agnostic, you name it, that are investigating New Testament studies and walking away. And we're highlighting them. We're trying to give them a platform to discuss their research. Mm-hmm. Do you find this happening in philosophy, in science, whatever the field might be, in an academic setting of research, where you're seeing people who are struggling with that cognitive dissonance and their work reflects this? So we have these variations of hypotheses, let's say, like in philosophy, for example. There are some people who want to talk about consciousness, and they want to say every little molecule's conscious, everything from the rock and the dirt, you name it, the turd that goes down the toilet to the shining, person who's speaking to other people, like you name it, everything's conscious. Do you think that there's this weird necessity to hold on to some higher being, some higher essence, rather than this approach that you've taken that kind of draws to a natural conclusion and stuff, because they're fearful of nihilism? Or what do you think? Do you think there's a motivated reasoning behind some of these conclusions?
Yeah, I think there probably is some motivated reasoning behind that. That one you mentioned of imbuing everything with consciousness, I've heard that before. There are scientists who will say that. Scientists do like to speculate, and it's okay to speculate as a scientist and say things for which you do not have good evidence, if you make it clear to people that you are speculating. You're telling them in advance, okay, what I'm about to say, I don't have any evidence for. Could be wrong, could be completely wrong, could be wildly wrong. But wouldn't it be interesting if protons had consciousness and rocks had consciousness and so on? Maybe consciousness is a thing that a force field of some kind that emanates throughout the universe or whatever. There are scientists who do that. But when they're doing it, they're not really being scientists. They're telling you that. They're kind of going off script. They're going off the rails of the scientific method, and they're talking in a speculative, fanciful, fun way. And maybe doing that will lead them to think about some new experiment they could do that won't really get them all the way there, but will still be an interesting experiment to do and might actually tell us something about the way real consciousness does work. Mm-hmm. So scientists do a lot of speculating. And that's okay as long as we all know when they're speculating and when they aren't. And I feel like there was something else I wanted to say about that, but it doesn't. I've kind of lost my train of thought for right now. Might have had something to do with Francis Collins. For some reason, I think there was something he said along those lines. Anyway, maybe I should just let it go at that.
Yeah, I guess just re-emphasizing, are there people in the field, and maybe you can touch on that. Are there people in the field that you would look at and go, yeah, it seems like their reasoning is driven by their hope, or they have this.
Thank you.
Yeah,
you
motivated reasoning.
Yes, the scientists do suffer from that. We are not immune to that at all. We do get wedded to our hypotheses sometimes, and it's very hard for us to shake that. The great physicist Richard Feynman put it beautifully. He said he was trying to give advice to students, I think, about how to be a scientist and how to be a good scientist. And he said that the most important thing about being a good scientist is being honest with yourself. You must be careful not to trick yourself, not to fool yourself. And you are the easiest one to fool. And what he meant by that was that we have these emotions, this emotional attachment to ideas and to our own discoveries and our own interpretations of our discoveries. And we tend to latch onto them, and we sometimes will misinterpret our own experiments because of this. I can give you a specific example of, I won't mention any names, but there was a controversy, mainly I guess around the 1980s is when it was raging, about the evolution of birds. Mm-hmm. And it was becoming apparent from paleontology, as more and more dinosaur fossils were emerging, especially some new and interesting ones were emerging from China at that time, as China was starting to open up to the world scientifically. And Chinese paleontologists were publishing these amazing bird-like fossils of dinosaurs. And it was beginning to become apparent that there was this direct line of descent from theropod dinosaurs to birds. And the conclusion from that is that dinosaurs are actually not extinct. There is one line of dinosaurs that has survived to the present day, and we call them birds. Okay, so this was controversial at first, and there were people who said, no, that's not right. There's a different, the branch happens earlier in the tree, and it's not from dinosaurs, and so on. So there was you could argue it both ways given the data we had. And I remember seeing a documentary during this time, or near the end of this time, maybe it was the 1990s by the time I saw this, when they were showing some fossils of these ancient bird-like dinosaurs, and the show was really about how flight evolved in birds. And there was one scientist who was very much sort of wedded to this idea that, no, this dinosaur hypothesis is wrong, and here's why. And it was almost painful to watch, because everybody else in the show, all of the other scientists in the show, had accepted the fact that the evidence was now overwhelming, that there is this direct line of descent from dinosaurs to birds, and yet he could not quite make that step. He was fooling himself the way Feynman warned against. So it does happen. We do make mistakes. Individual scientists can be horrendously wrong, but science as a whole corrects for that. Our colleagues who are not as emotionally invested in our personal hypotheses, they will have, at some point when they become numerous, they'll just ignore us. They'll write the books, they'll write the papers, and science will move on. And we do find the truth that way.
This has been a blast. What a journey. I hope everybody watching has enjoyed. I know I have. I always enjoy learning from you. And I hope people go check out your website. I'm going to put that in the chat here for anybody who wants to go and check you out further. Always learn something unique from you. I love the way that you approach the whole topic of from infants to their mothers and this relationship and illusions as well. You know, I run across all the time on YouTube or Facebook when I'm going through the little short videos that they have. There's someone with a fake arm, and then they like convince them by petting the real hand behind the wall and the fake arm at the same time. You know, then eventually they're hitting the hand that's fake, and it hurt. And it's like, it's not even your hand. And so your brain's already connecting to that fake arm. It's really fun to see that, and how there's illusions that we believe are moving or doing things that they're not doing, or perceptions off. And we need something measurable, testable to be able to help correct that. And so it's an interesting hypothesis, or is it a theory, would you say?
It becomes a theory when the hypothesis makes testable predictions and the tests have passed. When you've done the test and the predictions are upheld, then we start calling it a theory.
Where are you at, or where is your hypothesis at in this journey?
What I would say is the hypothesis I advance in my books is I still call it a hypothesis because although some aspects of it, you know, I can find plenty of evidence from experiments people have already done that are in the literature that sort of support it, but the sort of new predictions that I make in there have not been specifically tested. So I still call it a hypothesis, and I'm hoping that some group of psychologists and biologists and neuroscientists and so on will eventually take it seriously enough that they'll start trying to do some of the tests that I suggest.
I'm looking forward to hearing from them as well. I want to see what they have to say, and hopefully we discover more and find out where you might be wrong. Like what do you need to tweak? How do you need to adjust your hypothesis? That's that's probably the most fun, right? As a scientist, you're like, someone's going to see something that I'm missing, or maybe I put something into this that isn't necessary, that without it, you can still explain this. But I'm curious to see what comes from if they take the time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely right too. And I can tell you, I can promise you, there are details in there that must be incorrect. I just don't know which ones.
We need to get the scientists behind it. Go check out The Illusion of God's Presence, The Biological Origins of Spiritual Longing, and The Phantom God, what neuroscience reveals about the compulsion to believe. Join our Patreon, support us. We've got a lot of videos that we're doing at all times. I'm always editing, always putting in new stuff, working. I've got some scholars coming. Dr. Dennis R. McDonald's coming in January, the beginning of January. Dr. Kip Davis is coming at the end of January. I'm taking Patreon members' questions, and throw me one question, because sometimes people try to throw in multiple, and I want to record your question 4K in person with the academics, so you'll have your question asked just for supporting us here at MythVision. I don't see anybody else doing that, so I'm offering this. Been doing it for a while now, making specifically a video for you, right? Like, I edit it, I put a lot of hard work into this, all of that for your support. So we really appreciate it. Any final words from you, Dr. Wathey?
I would just like to say that for anybody who's making this transition from religious thinking to free thinking, you're going to reach a point where it becomes a point of no return, like almost like that scene in The Matrix where Neo swallows the red pill. And you have to make the decision, are you going to swallow that pill or not? Because at some point, you're going to be like the astronaut who has seen the Earth from space. You can no longer believe the Earth is flat. So just that little bit of warning.
Yeah, fair warning. But I will say I found quite a lot of freedom psychologically in this, and comfort too, and knowing, I did a video yesterday and I mentioned it's us, and people are like, how egotistical and how this and that, when I said I went and traveled the hills of religion, and at the end there was a mirror and it was me, it was my cognitive faculties, it was me all along, right? But there's that Mariah Carey song that I always listened to when I was young. I think it was on one of those movies, cartoon movies that she was on, but she has a song called Hero. And like, she goes through, like, you're going through this tough time and whatnot, but really it was you. There's a hero in you, right? The whole time. And that's the kind of myth, the narrative I want to give, that I hope people will start to find the answers in that respect. It's us. We got it. We don't need to have the fairy tales. We have what it takes. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Until next time, we are MythVision.